This is Gabriel Custodiet of Watchman Privacy. I know why you're here. You're looking to escape the technocratic apparatuses that you see slowly enveloping you and restraining your freedom. For the fundamentals of privacy, you should start by visiting escapethetechnocracy.com to see my video tutorials, books, and other resources for getting off the surveillance grid. Watchman Privacy and Escape the Technocracy are leading the fight for privacy, and unlike just about any other show, we practice what we preach. Private payment options, no threat modeling, no statist or collectivist solutions, and no sponsors, ever. You know what that means? It means we can speak the unmitigated truth as we see it. Your support alone determines the future of this show. Go support you and me at escapethetechnocracy.com. I'm very pleased today to be joined by Roger Huang, and he's a repeat guest. I had him previously on another episode, and he's the author of a book called Would Mao Hold Bitcoin, the Past, Present, and Future of Bitcoin in Techno-Nationalist China. That's how I encountered him. And this is one of these books that, if you're a Bitcoiner, obviously you want to be supporting your fellow Bitcoiner. But for everybody else who's not interested in Bitcoin, this is still, in my view, one of these top 5 books, I would say, if you want to understand China, simply because you're talking about a person who has a very unique perspective, coming to the West, being born in China, having a little bit of an adversarial mindset, and really doing a lot of the work in terms of economics and political study and these sorts of things. So I think it's absolutely one of these books that you need to have if you want to understand China. So really pleased to be bringing back Roger onto the show. So Roger, welcome back to the show. Maybe also just tell people a little bit about some other things you get up to in case they only know you from this particular book.
Yeah, no, Gabriel, first, thanks for having me on. It's always great to, be on the show with Watchman Privacy. And also just, I've been listening to some of your other interviews, like I think your one with Max and like a couple of others. So always great to be on here. Some of the other things I've been kind of working on are, I do write for Forbes, and that's like a little bit more general. So I don't love the fact that they run like ads on some of the content I'm doing, but it's all good. I guess we all have to make some money somehow. But yeah, that's kind of generally like some of the articles I'm coming out with are going to be more broad-based. So for example, I've written about the whole Telegram case, what happened there. Probably going to write something about just like the war against end-to-end encryption from a little bit more of a systematic perspective. And I've written about like in Bangladesh, for example, they censored the internet when the students were protesting and being, for lack of a better word, like murdered by the state. So yeah, just kind of putting that together. That's like one thing I do. I was talking to Gabriel a little bit with you about this. I'm working on a second book, which is going to be more broad. And the general idea is to hopefully help people follow the same rabbit hole I have, through circumstance. I've been someone who's been looking at privacy preserving technologies throughout my life. Some of them I have to use in practice, right? Because just communicating with the Chinese internet, which we'll get into, you have to understand kind of how all this works to a certain degree. And so, yeah, I think the working subtitle is like, how not to be replaced by AI and to own the future or something like that. But we'll see how we can iterate around that. But always glad to be on here.
Let us, though, do start with some questions on China. People are very interested in this massive country that has profound power in global politics these days. And I want to start with going back a little bit into the past of China, because in the middle of the 20th century, we have the rise of Chinese communism. Mao Zedong comes to power, and they really model themselves on the USSR in many ways. But as time progresses and the USSR starts to collapse, it seems that the model of basically just pure totalitarianism that the USSR had adopted and had used doesn't seem to work. And the USSR collapses, and China, no doubt at this time, sees that the writing might be on the wall for them. So they change course. And this is an amazing transformation in the last 3 or 4 decades, where they really lessen up, they really ease up and have some of these release valves where they let people do more and more things. Just curious about that moment in time. What did China, the powers that be in China, what did they understand about the USSR model? How did they decide to go a different course so that they could remain in power?
Yeah, I mean, that period of history is one of the most interesting periods of history. And I highly encourage people to like study as much about it if they can. It starts with the change in leadership. So when Mao Zedong died, there was a room for a new generation of leaders. And actually, Mao's successors were not ones that he had chosen. It was actually people who, by and large, were purged. Deng Xiaoping kind of tricked Mao's designated successor at the time and was able to kind of seize power by himself. And Deng, there's like a good bio about him by like Ezra Vogel and like a couple of others, if people have just want general reading about the time period. But Deng Xiaoping was kind of an interesting character. He was in Paris for a certain period of time, so he was exposed to what was happening in the West. He was one of the revolutionaries along with Mao. He was on the Long March, a veteran of many military campaigns as Mao fought the Chinese Civil War. And I think he came out of it with a very distinctly different view than Mao. So Mao actually, before he died, he was really mad. And there was this thing called the Sino-Soviet split. That's actually what allowed the United States and China to establish relationships. So Nixon and Kissinger kind of saw an opening there because Mao actually hated what the Soviet Union was becoming. And namely, the Soviet Union was trying to dismantle Stalin's legacy at the time. You know, to Mao, this was something that I think he had a lot of fear about because he saw himself as the originator of the Chinese Communist Party and the nation that kind of evolved from it, right? When he died, Deng Xiaoping was very, very different. He was part of a generation of leaders that had borne the consequences of this kind of leadership mentality, of this like aspiring to be not just the Soviet Union, but Stalin's Soviet Union, a one-man show, a personality cult. A lot of the leaders that Deng Xiaoping kind of enfranchised were people who deeply hated or resented what Mao did during that time period, especially during the Cultural Revolution, which was kind of that period right before Mao's death, where a lot of chaos happened because Mao was trying to unleash the political youth in order to kind of accomplish his goals. He was very insecure about his succession and his designated successor at the time. This generation of new leadership was pretty unique. They were definitely trying to get away from Mao Zedong and the kind of cult of personality one-man leadership that the USSR embodied under Stalin. And so that was the idea before Xi Jinping actually dismantled them, of a 10-year kind of term limit for the paramount leader. And Deng Xiaoping actually, even though he was essentially the power, behind the throne for pretty much until he died, he actually stepped down, at least in terms of some of the official roles that he held. So what was more important was kind of like the leaders that he elevated. And all of the leaders that he elevated tended to be, I wouldn't say all, but I would say many of them tended to be kind of people who saw like, hey, like Mao-style leadership didn't work for China. We want to get away from that. But they were mixed about whether or not they would go back to socialism or whether or not there were market reforms that needed to happen. And Deng Xiaoping was kind of in the middle of that too. He was always like split between these two camps. And so he had some reformers, Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, who were more aggressive than he was on economic reform, and especially on political reform. And I think that period in time is so fascinating. I could probably go on for hours. One thing I think that China has learned from that time period is first that, economic prosperity matters. And the way that you go about constructing that, capitalism can be a tool that the party kind of uses to get there. Right. And we've seen kind of like the end result of that, or we are seeing the result of that as China evolves, as it's grown from a country with, North Korea like GDP levels per capita to now the second largest economy in the world. And certainly a middle power when it comes to GDP per capita, just because there's so many people in China, but like exponentially more. Like we're talking about like almost like a 100x like order of magnitude change in terms of what the Chinese people were like in terms of material conditions before and after. But of course, that has a lot of different consequences. I can unpack like a few of them. I've been reading, actually, you caught me at a good time. I've been reading Liu Xiaobo's kind of like essays, and he was someone who really grew up during that period of time. And I think someone who was able to, unfortunately, he died as a result of being imprisoned by the Chinese state. But he actually also experienced some of the dynamism of the Chinese internet and was able to express some of his thoughts. kind of coming from that time period. If I'm going to choose like one thing, and then Gabriel, like, love to throw it to you in terms of different questions. It's something that I focus on in my book is that inflation was really a fault line between these kind of two factions I described. Like one faction that was pushing Deng Xiaoping to really not just reform economically and say like, hey, we need more, Chinese people need to have more freedom to earn. You know, under Mao, there was no private enterprise. You know, if you organize a company above a certain number, you were banned, right? Like peasants were assigned to communes where they had to contribute work and then get their results back. Like literally, like there was no idea of like taking salaries, and prices were fixed through use of force. You know, and Deng Xiaoping had kind of like two factions. Now they had the reformers who were not only just willing to say like, hey, we should give the Chinese people the ability to earn money, but also went so far as to say, you know, there's nothing we can learn from Mao. You know, we have the need to have freedom of press. Chinese people should not only be able to earn money, they should be able to choose their political representatives. There should be freedom of media and things like that, which is obviously it would be radical in China now, and was quite radical in China then. But inflation was the fault line, because what happened was the reformers, and then there was a faction I would call the conservatives, I guess, for lack of a better word. The reformers really lost their argument because of the inflation that kind of ensued. As soon as there were price reforms and prices were allowed to float freely. Now that came along with the growth, right? But because it was so sudden, at some points it was annualized, I think like 18.5% inflation. And keep in mind, Chinese people were not used to inflation at the time. You know, the faction that ended up winning out was kind of like the conservative faction. And that has culminated throughout the years. I think it's like a generational thing. Like you just always forget the most vivid lesson the previous generation was trying to send you. And that conservative faction that won has ultimately culminated into a Xi Jinping-like reign that is the closest we've seen to Mao in many respects in China since that time period.
When I was younger and trying to get my hands on basically any Marxist scholarship that I could at the time, I remember there was a line from one of these Marxist theorists, and he said, capitalism is infinitely malleable, able to turn the problems it creates into new marketing opportunities. But it sounds like that's much more a characteristic of communism, especially as it evolves in the 20th century and it becomes just, how do we keep power at all costs, right? How do we keep power? Do we have these release valves? Do we give people a little bit of free markets, even though they don't necessarily have political freedom? So it's very interesting how that transpires. And instead of remaining on that topic, let's have people go pick up your excellent book where you spend many pages on that topic, uncovering it. And let's fast forward instead a little bit to the future here, Roger, where we see some of the effects of this market liberalization, shall we say. And there's another really cool book that I recommend to people getting to China. It's called Age of Ambition by Evan Osnos. And he spends the first 2 decades, right around there of the 21st century in China as it's having this massive transformation. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people that are brought out of poverty. We're talking about luxury chains that are now setting up shop in Chinese cities, this amazing rise of prosperity, material prosperity of China. And I wonder if you could just kind of take us to this moment. What exactly is happening, what it's like? You know, I figure you grew up in this era. So just tell people a little bit, like what happened in 21st century in China.
Yeah, one thing I should point out as we're talking about this is that Evan has actually released a kind of second part of his book, which I think is called The Age of Malaise or something. He wrote an essay. Yeah, he's been writing about like recently in China, you know, things have taken a little bit. So there's like kind of like a pretty big difference between what's happening in China now and I think even in the early 21st century. But certainly, you know, that time frame of the age of ambition that we're talking about. Listen, I talk to a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs. I used to go back and forth between China and Canada pretty much every year. And a lot of the things that Evan describes. Now, I think where Evan is a little bit, and I'm not saying I by all means have all perspective on this, but one area where Evan has like less perspective, or expat writers like him tend to have less perspective, is in the like second tier or third tier cities, because they tend to be people that will be going to Beijing and Shanghai and like talking to the elites. So it's sort of like, which is not wrong, but like if you go to the United States and you talk only to people in Manhattan and only to people in San Francisco, you are going to get a certain view of just how the United States is that may not be like entirely representative.
In fact, I'd say completely distorted in a certain sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So just throwing that out there. I'm not saying like Evan's observations in the age of ambition, I think they are by and large kind of correct. But one thing I want to point out is like those people, just like people in San Francisco, New York City, might have less in common with people in like, let's say, I'm just going to throw out random names here, like Iowa or well, I don't know, like Heartland America, right? There's also in China, I think, the people in Beijing and Shanghai who are working as part of the global tech class have probably more in common with the people in San Francisco and New York City as like kind of like the product managers, the high kind of like e-commerce kind of selection than their compatriots in kind of rural areas where there's a protracted inequality between those two areas. Just to speak a little bit about that time period, though, like you did feel that energy. And I think it was two things. Like one is that China was investing a lot into infrastructure at the time. And so tangibly speaking, you would see changes every year. So every time I went back to Shanghai, there would be a new like kind of world record skyscraper for the highest skyscraper in kind of like Shanghai's kind of like district in the middle of Pudong. But like anyways, whatever. Like the place where they have all these skyscrapers. So you start at the beginning, it was like the Shanghai Pearl. And then you had like I kind of forget all the names of them, but like, the Shanghai Stock Exchange building, all this. So you almost every year you would see a new kind of like building just kind of emerge. And then you would see like, the maglev trains and stuff like that. So that is very true and reminiscent of that period of that energy. I will say, unlike I think some of the sanitized versions of China that have been presented, that did not come without some cost as well. Like there was a lot of construction and it was gleaming and it was modern. And if you had just stepped on the maglev train from the airport and when I was like going to Shanghai pretty often, that was when they were building the new Pudong airport. Because Shanghai has like kind of two airports. It used to have Hongqiao, which is like the domestic airport now. And then they were building the Pudong airport. So it was like gleaming new. And there was a maglev train directly from that airport to the city. So if you were on it, you really felt like, wow, this is like China kind of is building all these amazing things. Like we're generations away. We were just one generation away from like starvation almost. And then it's like these shiny, gleaming kind of stuff. But if you did kind of like walk around, you would look at like some of the stuff that would happen in the cracks. The example I always remember vividly is like, just looking at like any of the waterways in Shanghai, they were like always super polluted, like super, super polluted, super dirty, like trash everywhere, that kind of thing. And I thought it was a good metaphor for like, that period of time where there was a lot of really impressive, especially physical infrastructure. So you could really feel that kind of like sense of ambition as Evan describes, not only from an individual perspective, from like a national perspective.
He has a good statistic. He says that China at the time was building the square footage equivalent of Rome every 2 weeks.
Yeah, I've also read the book. I don't think I remember that exact stat, but I'm not surprised, or I wouldn't be surprised. And the other thing I would add to that is that it certainly felt that way. And it had I guess I had like a really unique experience of China because I would go for like a few months but like every year kind of thing. Like I would go and then I would go back to like the States or Canada. And so it was very noticeable, especially in comparison to the fact that many of the Canadian or American cities I was in, there was not construction at all. Or, in some places, I grew up in Montreal. So like in Montreal, the downtown basically has not changed at all in the last like 20 or 30 years. So you could really feel that. The other thing I would just say is that the age of ambition, like it feels really real in terms of the Chinese entrepreneurs I talk to. Chinese entrepreneurs, like huge hustlers. I can't describe it. It's almost like the baseline is like just higher. I've observed just having like had a little bit of experience. I don't want to say I have like a ton of experience with like the Chinese tech context because I've never worked for a Chinese tech company. But I've talked with like some Chinese entrepreneurs. I've done about as much reading as you can do about these things. Like Kai-Fu Lee's book kind of talks about this a little bit too. Evan's book kind of touches a little bit on like the drive of different entrepreneurs. I think he spends a lot of time on the woman who's doing the Confucianism Academy. But aside from that, I think he also cites some of the tech startups in Beijing. What you really have is this sense. And I've spent some time thinking about why that might be the case. My operating hypothesis is kind of like this, from cultures. And I think it's like generally applicable to places that are like high growth. Like places that are high growth, it's relative. So we've lived in some countries, in Canada and the States and Europe, I would say, Japan, Korea are certainly symptoms of this too, where all the growth kind of happened a generation before. And in China, the growth was happening like during that time period in the 2000s. And I think that just like spurs a different kind of incentive. And even today, a lot of my stuff now is like Bitcoin related. So I go to like Bitcoin conferences or whatever. And you can talk to the people who are building different companies and things like that. And whether I have different opinions on what's being built, like I don't really think a lot of the stuff being built is that valuable in my opinion, but I can't question the fact that there is a lot being built and that there's a very strong motivation to be very entrepreneurial. Chinese people worship money and are prepared to go to really extreme lengths to be able to get money in order to get paid. And I think this explains some of the like Chinese companies that you just see emerging coming out. Like I do think that I don't know, like I don't want to be too broad about it, but it just seems like Chinese entrepreneurs are in general, I don't want to say like each and every one, but in general are more willing to like kill and die for something. Versus in the West, you find it a little bit more like, oh yeah, this is like 9 to 5 and we can't do this because they'll sue us and like this kind of stuff. And the Chinese entrepreneurs are very rough and tumble. They are the true definition of like fail fast and break a lot of stuff.
Yeah, no, all kinds of stories about that. You mentioned the book by Kai-Fu Lee, and that one's AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order. That was a very enlightening book as well about the kind of the Chinese work ethic from also a guy who's spent time between China and the US. Now, you mentioned, you're hinting at this, and you've mentioned it in your book, the spiritual void in China. I want to touch on that for a moment because I read something at one point. It was like China is the only main civilization that has never really had a central religion, and that was interesting. It's always kind of been about the present moment, perhaps, or maybe tied to some sense of heredity and ancestry and things like this. But there is a huge component of the present moment, and I think communism also has that right atheistic element where as you say, heaven is supposed to be now, and people are very aware if that is not happening. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the spiritual void in China, how it affects people, how very important topic. Just your thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, I encourage people to read about this topic is can be very vast. So the kind of unofficial state religion has been this weird version of Confucianism that has been propagated around the world. You see it in a lot of otherwise pretty smart individuals in their field. I always catch myself realizing that they sometimes take data or information at face value. So specifically, not that I think Vitalik is like super smart or anything, but like Vitalik and Ray Dalio demonstrate this the most to me. Also Kissinger to a certain extent, but Kissinger also has really weird thoughts on the Asian mind and all this other stuff. But they seem to think that Confucianism is kind of this like very rooted concept. There's writers, Jeffrey Wasserstrom is one, who is a dean of history at UC Irvine, I'd like to say. And he's got like a few books about Chinese history and things like that. And he's got some pretty interesting thoughts. I think if you just look up his name and like Confucius. Evan Osnos actually wrote an essay in the New Yorker, which kind of summarized it a little bit, which is called Confucius Comes Home, and Liu Xiaobo, actually, speaking of Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who had his works translated into English. It's really unfortunate because like his Chinese works are like his original works in Mandarin are like pretty hard to find because most of them have been censored or taken down or anyways. So I think the best record I found of stuff is actually like the English translation by Perry Link, which is called No Hatred, No Enemies, which I'm actually just finished right before talking, so it's top of mind. And they kind of make the point that Confucianism is really like Confucius himself was kind of like a stray dog. It's kind of like my favorite view. Someone who was looking to be a teacher to state power, but was never really successful at doing that. And who kind of came up with this thing called like the way, which was then essentially like assimilated into Chinese statecraft and promulgated as kind of like a source of legitimacy for Chinese leadership. Certainly, it misses some of the elements of a religion, but what I think is kind of interesting with that is that was more close to mapping kind of like my basic theory is that a lot of modern states now are essentially like secularized versions of like religious aspects. So like, for example, like in the Quran and in other places, you have a food code, right? And now you have a health department. You know, the state now provides like loaves and wine, for lack of a better metaphor. And in China, that transformation was like a little bit easier to make because Confucius himself has never, well, kind of regarded as like a semi-deity, but like was just more closely correlated as like a kind of like way of living or like a way of governance that could lend legitimacy to any form of governance. And certainly the Chinese Communist Party now lends itself on this Confucianism as a way to kind of like root itself back to all the way back through China's history as a kind of like an indigenous tradition that is resistant perhaps to some of the edges of Western political theory that they want to kind of defray. So almost like we have a political tradition here too, and a political philosophy and a semi-religious philosophy that can be used to justify our own rule. And that is the version of Confucianism. Now, there's a lot of fights over what Confucianism is. There's new Confucianism. Mao did a lot to destroy Confucius's legacy in China. He called the Red Guards to kind of actually destroy Confucius's tomb. I don't know if they destroyed it, but basically he like unburied Confucius and all this other stuff. So there has been that kind of strand. And Chinese culture has at various times embraced different religions. So there is a strong Muslim community, especially towards the Western side of China, especially among the Uyghurs, but also among an ethnic group known as the Hui, who are essentially Han Chinese who are Muslim and have been historically Muslim for quite a while. You know, there's Buddhism. Buddhism and the bridge between India and China has also been a presence in Chinese culture and history for a very, very long time. But I would say that the spiritual void that I described previously before here as well is actually something that Evan Osnos describes as well in some of his essays, and I believe in The Age of Ambition, is really this idea that for individuals, there isn't really this like guidance anymore. So like Confucianism or New Confucianism, really what Liu Xiaobo points out in his book, which I agree with, is that Confucianism is just like a bunch of slogans. Like you can take some stuff from the Analects and like kind of apply it, but really it's almost like as if you were basing your entire like lifestyle and ideology on like dailyquotes.com or something. It's very like odd to me to see, you know, and so this is why I say like when I see people who are like Vitalik or Ray Dalio who are like, well, you know, you see China has had Confucianism for so long. This is the reason why like machine learning is so advanced in China, or they have this competitive advantage. I'm just very confused by that because Confucianism in practice is kind of all over the place. The thing is like, you know, Confucianism, Buddhism, and all these other religions or religious groups, there isn't quite like a daily, like, how should we live? There isn't really like a cardinal North Star. From what I've observed in China, the cardinal North Star now is money. And money that still feels in a very new money way. Because and I've observed this not just in China, but in Dubai, other places. I've never been to Dubai, but what I've heard about Dubai is it's very similar to China in the sense that it's wealth, but it's almost wealth in a very garish way. I think in the, you know, more developed economies, I guess you can say, there's kind of like a premium to not being out there, you know, and yeah, I mean, if you're wearing a nice watch and all this other stuff, it's more subtle. But in China, and from what I heard, the United Arab Emirates, which I think is suffering from something similar, it's not just money. It's like you are wearing your money, you are consuming your money, and you're being very, very obvious about it. So you see people decked out in like logos and logos and logos, like Louis Vuitton, Gucci, and it's just a really interesting thing to think about because nominally China is a communist country, but most of its people seem to be really obsessed with Western brands. Lululemon is like a new hot one, for example. So it feels like every time a brand gets really hot in the West, 5 years or 10 years later, it gets really hot in China. And it's almost like Chinese people are following kind of the trend of like, what does money look like right now? And with work from home and all this other stuff, like money in the West right now looks like athleisure, looks like Lululemon, looks like the ability to show up to work, I think, in sweatpants, basically. And you're starting to see that kind of pick up in China, where like the things that are hot are like, all the stuff that was hot like 10 years ago, like yoga studios, like vegan food, and all this other stuff. So that seems to be kind of like the religion of China now. And that creates some consequences. Like I talked to a lot of, or I shouldn't say a lot of, but I talked to like one or two old people in China who have been through it all. And they mention it as like, they don't recognize it anymore. There are like no values. With Mao was a totalitarian dictator. He killed a lot of people. A lot of the stuff he did was unforgivable, but he had a very clear ethos for why he did what he did. In China, the language of it is just so compromised. You were saying that communism is adaptable. And I would say that that's an interesting point. And I think that very specifically, China and the Chinese state leadership seems to be the most malleable version of this. And I think it's somewhat of a specific quirk of how Deng Xiaoping himself was not really a Marxist theorist. He was more like a nationalist who was a kinetic kind of leader, who was a military leader above all else, and who kind of left his philosophy to other people. And I think you see some of that legacy in China now because there is not really, I don't think, like a strong philosophical uptake. I have a lot of opinions on Xi Jinping. We can talk about that and his ability to understand and formulate a coherent ideology. I think he needs to rely, just like Deng Xiaoping did, on other thinkers to be able to do that. But just to wrap up, because I know I've been kind of ranting on this for a while now, I think in China, the spiritual void has led to many dramatic consequences for individuals struggling to understand like what is good or what is bad. And this played out in like very direct ways. Like in China, there was a huge discussion because one time there was a car, someone did a hit and run on like a child in the streets. And the child was left there for, I think, like a very long time, like 2 hours, 3 hours, and multiple people passed by and did not help the child, who was obviously in distress. And then finally, some poor, peasant, like kind of came and rescued the child. And this became kind of, I think, like a story that encapsulated this like metaphor of like, what are our values and morals these days? It seems like the only thing that's worth really talking about is making money and earning money and living in the here and now. And that has been something that Chinese netizens and others have, I think, wrestled with to a level deeper than I think Western countries may or may not realize. And lastly, I think the last point I'm going to harp on this for is that I believe that a lot of this void is because the Chinese state, the Chinese party state, is looking for control, a control mechanism, but more than anything else is looking for an indigenous philosophy that can be resistant to the Western liberal tradition. And I think it has had to rely on foreign thinkers for a lot of that. There has been an indigenous, it's kind of this search for an indigenous tradition that can be resistant to that. And for that, China has had to go to all kinds of weird places, like some of its most prominent academics. There is that school that is trying to source from like Confucius, from Taoism, from like all the old kind of traditions. But there's also a school which we don't know how much power they have, which seems to be formulating a kind of alternative to the Marxist-Leninist kind of position. So first, of course, Marx is a foreign thinker in the Chinese intellectual tradition. And now it seems that in order to justify state power, repression over what's happening in Hong Kong, The idea is to rely on sources like Carl Schmitt and Leo Strauss, who are very, very different thinkers, and in some ways are fundamentally incompatible with Chinese communism. But just kind of like what you mentioned, that's kind of been a really interesting part, is how malleable China has been to these sources in order to search for that. But an ideology that is a negative ideology, like is meant in defense of, and is still meant to kind of justify that individuals, can't kind of raise to a certain level, does not give the individual a lot of instruction. It gives the individual a lot of incentives to understand that in order to succeed in China, you should probably make a lot of money, or you should probably be a part of the party. And those are kind of, to a certain extent, synonymous with each other. You have to basically be part of the party if you're making a lot of money, or if one career path that is certainly very safe is to become a party official. So, well, I mean, plus or minus, like, you might be caught up in like whatever corruption or whatever, but like in general, there is like, you will be taken care of by the party if you advance within the party ranks. So this indigenous tradition, because it doesn't have positive vision, and because, again, like, I strongly believe that Confucianism is essentially just a series of like daily quotes, some of which are like very irrelevant in the modern age. It's kind of like, well, how can you create like a moral system from that? And I think that's what's missing. That's what I kind of term the spiritual void. And then that's what kind of creates these consequences. One of which I've observed is, like, for example, the thing I observed in China would never have happened in Japan. In Japan, what I think is very interesting, maybe because of the Shintoism, maybe because they've been a developed country for long, I don't want to hypothesize too much, but the places are clean even where the tourists don't go, which is kind of like an interesting kind of like facet. In China, the places are very clean where the tourists go, but if you start straying away a little bit too far, you get to see a lot of griminess. And I think that's like a good metaphor for how China's spiritual emptiness is trying to portray ideological strength, but is missing kind of like some kind of inner conviction. And so the system as a whole looks ordered on the outside, but is actually quite disordered on the inside.
You covered, is my understanding, the Hong Kong protests years ago. I think a lot of people have kind of forgotten about Hong Kong. Some people think it's just a losing battle. What is the current state of that city? And I guess, what's its future? What do you observe from Hong Kong?
Yeah, I briefly visited Hong Kong during the protests. I was actually there after the 2014 protests as well. But unfortunately, both times I had actually kind of missed the brunt of the action. When I was there in Hong Kong briefly, that was actually when Tsai Ing-wen was getting reelected. And so most of the Hong Kong activists were actually in Taiwan at the time. So it's a little bit of bad timing on my part. But yeah, I did do some writing on the topic. It was mostly Bitcoin focused because I was writing the book and all this other stuff. But yeah, the current state of things in Hong Kong, look, so I've had the opportunity to go back, but have not taken it so far. I think that Hong Kong, from what I've observed from friends who have gone back since then, since post-COVID, I would say, as well as people who have left. And again, that's a little bit of a biasing view because obviously people who have stayed will probably have better things to say about Hong Kong. But I think the current state of play right now is let me start with like just the economics of it and just like kind of what's happening. What's the state of Hong Kong? Like Hong Kong as a city feels less dynamic. A lot of the companies that left were American companies, and those have been replaced gradually by mainland companies, as well as by some European companies. Mainland companies have really taken that toehold. And what I've been told is that Hong Kong now feels more and more like any other mainland city, basically. The difference has really collapsed. And you can actually see some of the like physical manifestations of this. Like the lights are no longer as shining as they used to be. The art scene has kind of like collapsed a little bit. Yeah, it's just like a very different kind of stance. Yeah, I agree with you on the fact that it seems it's a forgotten protest. Well, I would say in general, China has been forgotten. Just the whole Asia Pacific region. I've had a few friends who write about China, and they've all observed how it's almost like the locus of the world shifts. The eye of the world. It's almost like if we can think of the world's media diet, it's kind of like an eye of Sauron. And how much of that is directed, how much of that is, improvised, I guess, we'll have to ask the lizard people. But when it comes to China, certainly it seems like there's just less attention paid to it. Like before, it was like everything in Hong Kong was headline news everywhere. And now it's like in order for there to be headline news, you need like a dramatic new development, of which there really isn't because, for example, most of the people are either arrested or exiled. So there is the Hong Kong 47, which are the political prisoners, mostly because they were trying to run a primary that was deemed illegal. I just recently the Democratic Party, which is kind of Hong Kong's longstanding opposition to, for lack of a better word, China favoring political parties, is being disbanded. The Civic Party, which was something similar, was disbanded in 2023. Yeah, certainly it seems like most of the people are either serving jail sentences, and this includes Jimmy Lai, who was the publisher of Apple Daily, or they are in exile. So, for example, Nathan Law, who is one of the student leaders, is in London, I believe now. And Agnes, who is also one of the student leaders, is in Toronto. And so there isn't really a lot of noise, I would say, on that front. I do think it's important, and I always try to emphasize what's happening. I think even at Bitcoin conferences, every once in a while, I'll just throw in like free the Hong Kong 47, free Jimmy Lai. I don't know. The impact of that is probably zero, aside from if someone from the party is minding me or something. But I do find it important to at least remind people that it exists. But I also think that there are kind of like systematic reasons for why, it's kind of like what I mentioned, the Eye of Sauron has kind of passed. And one of the things I would learn from what happened to the Hong Kong protests is that the government really used COVID restrictions and selectively enforced COVID restrictions to shut down the protests. And they were quite successful. And their draconian laws, I hate to say it, but by and large, in terms of the short term, it definitely seems to have worked. People in Hong Kong are quite scared. What it seems to have happened is that they have isolated the kind of cushy middle and made it clear that like they should not be associated with this kind of activity. So during the Hong Kong protests, you're talking about like millions of people on the streets. So certainly the Hong Kong protests motivated people beyond just your regular protesters. You were talking about a significant slice of Hong Kong life from across the board, right? Not just your traditional kind of like Democratic Party or Civic Party kind of diehards, but really Hong Kong people from across the spectrum. So I was talking with someone who lived in Hong Kong at the time, and they were kind of bringing up the point, like during the protests, there was a blue faction and a yellow faction, but there was never a red faction, meaning there was a faction that was blue in support of the Hong Kong police. And there was a faction that was yellow in support of the protesters. But there was not really a strong faction that was red and actually in support of the Chinese mainland. And so even in the terms of debate of how, first there was incredible mobilization for the yellow side, but also even in terms of the debate, it was almost like the mainland was persona non grata regardless. But I think what has happened is that Hong Kong's debate has shifted because the people who have stayed in Hong Kong are now more red-leaning than they were, than the population that has left, which is probably very yellow-leaning, very, protest-supporting. A lot of different people around the city are under a special visa class that Canada gave to Hong Kong citizens and residents. And so they're kind of scattered around here. But of course, that means that they're not there, right? They're not in Hong Kong. So yeah, I don't want to go like too much further than that, just because I have not been back to Hong Kong in quite a while. But these are just kind of observations I've had from people who have lived in the city, who have left. Some who do go back and forth every once in a while. It just does seem like the city's a little bit more dampened, and the protest is itself somewhat forgotten, but for I think some systematic reasons. And it's always good to, I think you were releasing a trailer on the topic. And I think it's always good to think about those different things. And what I would say, because I don't know if our future questions will cover this, is like the Hong Kong protests were also a very interesting cat and mouse game from a digital technology perspective. Both people, starting to get onto VPNs and using encrypted apps, and then others realizing that the police were using, for example, their public transit cards to track where they were going. So it is actually a pretty interesting case study, even if we think about it from like a blue team, red team. But maybe that will be like a future question of yours.
We did Escape the Technocracy did release a new trailer. We've been working on this, and it has several. It has a extended clip from the 2019 Prince Edward Station attacks, where you see some people getting beaten down by the police. Very powerful imagery, which is why we used it, and hopefully we don't forget the people in Hong Kong. Now, on that topic, let's, Roger, move into the realm of technology. This is something that will no doubt interest this audience. This is something that people have had to deal with in China for a while, the Chinese firewall, and a lot of the restrictions and surveillance that goes on in a country that is really trying to prevent information, to control people in certain ways, to have a big influence on what they see and don't see. Now, how effective is it? I'll let you answer that. But what about this as a question? What is it like to be in China with kind of a privacy minded attitude towards it? And let's say somebody is visiting China. What should they expect? What should they know? What can they get away with? What is acceptable? What's the overall scene for people in China who maybe want to use VPNs, maybe want to use cryptocurrency, maybe want to access parts of the internet that are not allowed by the Chinese firewall?
So I want to start with I used to work within mainland China, but for different American and Canadian companies. And when I say that, I don't mean like in a like very permanent way, but like every time I would travel to China, I'd basically still continue working, right? It was all remote stuff though. Yeah, the most annoying thing by far is just even getting access, which is becoming more and more annoying. Generally speaking, most Chinese people, when I talk to them about the Great Firewall, they're just most annoyed about the fact that they have to use a VPN. And then every time they use a VPN, it's pretty slow. I also suspect, based off the conversations I've had with some of them, that like they're not too discerning about like the security practices of the VPN in question. So ExpressVPN used to be pretty popular, and I knew a friend who worked there. They don't like. It's not conversations I have. With people in the West who use VPNs, you start getting conversations about like geographic kind of spoofing and like, do they have a logging policy? How do they take your payments? How's the information? How is it encrypted? What standard does it use? Does it use WireGuard? Blah, 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 etc. With people in China, I feel like the conversation is just like, does it work? Is it fast? So that's number one by and away. Like when you're navigating the Chinese firewall, that's like the most annoying thing to deal with. Just fundamental basics. When I was there in China, I don't know if it's the case now, but and hopefully like no one's listening to change this, but like Molvad worked in China. It was just like incredibly slow. So I used to just use Molvad, honestly, like when I was in China, and that seemed to work pretty well. And I was able to get work done and all this other stuff. But frankly, it was like super annoying to like actually work within not even just like from a privacy preserving perspective, but just like accessibility, like things were just super slow and all this other stuff. So I ended up most of the time when I wanted to get serious work done, I would actually leave and go to Hong Kong, which still does not have the Great Firewall over it as of yet. So that's one thing. The other thing is kind of like communicating with people in China. It's pretty difficult to do that without Weixin or any number of Chinese apps, which are like, you have to assume always surveilled and censorable at all times, right? And so I know a lot of people who are in touch with Chinese people, and the default app is just Weixin, which is basically in the West, it's called WeChat. That's kind of like the English version or the abroad or the overseas version. China basically has like an app that's essentially kind of like the domestic version of the ones that they bring out overseas. So just a quick example of that, TikTok is actually Douyin in China, because they still have to censor like all the foreign content from those kind of like channels. So they try to split out the two. Weixin and all these communication apps, like, yeah, they're directly surveilled. I know a story of someone who got suspended, and they actually, it really sucks in China if you get suspended from WeChat, because Weixin is really like an everything app. Like it's your LinkedIn, it's your payment solution. It's like everything all at once. I think this is very instructive, because I know in the West, people like Elon are always proposing like we should make X like the WeChat of everything. And I think this is it's a very hard no from me. And in China, you can see the consequences of this, because once you get suspended, for one thing, you get suspended from like everything. It's like, oh, you can't do payments anymore because you made like a certain DM. It's a very kind of like freaky thing to see. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this problem, and not to reveal the bag on like everything. Like I'm happy to like in more private chats like talk through anybody who's listened, or Gabriel, even with you. I'm happy to like if you are actually going to China, let me know. I don't really super recommend it, by the way, but I definitely have some pieces of advice. So I'm going to keep this a little bit more general, just like not to go super into specifics, because I found that the Chinese party state, like, no, I don't think I'm this like big presence or anything, but I think that anytime that someone comes up with, there's just like a lot of bureaucrats that are able to staff like, and they're able to do things like find Damus, like the Nostr client, like 2 days after it launched. So the Chinese party state is like pretty good red team when it comes to this kind of stuff. Like they will pick up on different things. Like so including, for example, like Matrix and Element, they actually ban the default IPs and addresses. So you're almost like, once you find a way to crack this, there's like kind of like an incentive for you to like not let too many people know, because once it's out in the ether, then that's something that, you know, a Chinese state official can pick up on and then refer back to the Cyberspace Administration of China. But in general, what I would say is that, you know, you definitely want to avoid all the Chinese comms apps if possible. You can still communicate with Chinese people with email. That's probably like the best. Phone numbers are usually surveilled, and China maintains a pretty tight hold on telecommunications. And so specifically, this has been an issue for people who tell Chinese sources, for example, like they should just download Signal, but then those people disappear. And it's like, well, why did it disappear? Well, it's because Signal sends a text by verification, and every phone number in China, and I think in Hong Kong as well, is registered with a real world ID. So you can't really buy like a VoIP or like an eSIM. I have not tried it in China. What I've heard is that journalists on the ground in China, as a general tactic, and again, I'm trying not to be like too specific, but they will use phone lines that are attributed to large public entities, sort of like using a payphone, in order to at least hide where their calls are coming from. So that's something as a security practice that you could do. So assuming you were in China, like probably your best bet is if you have to communicate online, you probably have to use email. Most Chinese people are not going to have access to the regular kind of apps, Signal, Telegram. I verified several times that Telegram does not work. Not that Telegram is particularly secure either, honestly, but Telegram does not work in China. Like you can download the app elsewhere, but then once you're in China, it doesn't work. A lot of VPN configs also don't work because China kind of plays this cat and mouse game. Like I mentioned, Element and a lot of like default Nostr relays. A lot of the like defaults, like if you self-host your own instances, you can communicate with the mainland, and frankly with anyone. So this is like a hidden perk for those people who are self-hosting anyways, because it's just like a better thing to do, right? Like, so for example, if you have your own Jitsi instance, an added perk of that is that, you know, your service is probably not banned by the Great Firewall or other things restricted to that. So just something I've noticed as well. But, you know, if you're in China, email, and, you know, I generally also just advise like not to bring devices with like anything on it.
That's what I was gonna say. If people they want to go to China just to check it out, they're not there to change things or be a radical or something. They're just trying to check it out. Maybe just go without, you know, with, as you say, without devices. Maybe a basic way of communicating with people back home if you need to, or email, as you say, and just kind of go about it. Expect that you're going to be surveyed every step along the way.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to be like tailed most likely. So for the average person, they actually will blend into the crowd a little bit if they stay in the tier one cities. So like Shanghai or Beijing, especially since China has kind of thrown the gates open to at least Europeans. So there is this like new, so they have visa free travel for most Europeans now. And so if you just go to Beijing and Shanghai and you're just like very touristy seeming, like you're not going to stand out from the crowd. And it's unlikely. I would just, as a best security practice, just not bring devices with any data on it. But it's unlikely that they're going to like really check in on you, to be honest, if you play this persona of a tourist. Having said that, as a security practice, as a best security practice, you should not bring devices with anything on it. You should communicate with people on email. And then the other thing that people are usually stuck on is like a lot of places in China only take digital payments. So they only take WeChat Pay and Alipay. And frankly, or the ECNY. And frankly, this is actually quite an annoyance for many tourists. I would just figure out ways it's hard, but I would just figure out ways to either A, have cash, or B, be with someone who has a WeChat Pay account. That's the other way you can kind of get around it. Easier said than done, I guess. For me, I have a lot of family and friends in China, so that's always been my solution, is just to like borrow their WeChat Pay account and then I'll just pay them back. But that is something that comes up if you're going to be privacy oriented. It is actually pretty difficult in some places to pay in cash. And the Chinese government has tried really hard to aggressively flag the ECNY as a potential solution to that. And that's going to be somewhat successful because some merchants just straight up refuse to accept cash.
Slightly different topic here. DeepSeek, the Chinese AI model that was released free and open source onto the world a few days or a couple days after the US had its rah moment with its own Stargate project that it announced. And then here comes China to kind of blow the doors off of that little celebration. We have, Urban and I have been testing this out. We have an entire course on this, the AI resistance course, where we talk about DeepSeek. But what are your thoughts about DeepSeek as a technology and also as maybe a product of China?
Yeah, I think, well, I'm going to start more with the product of China stuff because I think I can add a little bit more perspective on that. From a technology standpoint, I've actually not played with DeepSeek as of yet. But I mean, I'd love to locally implement it sometime and just kind of play around with it and see what, I've seen some of the back and forth between different people. You and Urban might actually have really good opinions on whether or not I generally think probably not, but whether there's security or technology implications in there. I think from a tech perspective, like from what I've seen, generally it's impressive considering the yield, like for certain benchmarks. But anyways, in any case, as a product of the country, some of the stuff that's like a little underrated that I'm always trying to surface, DeepSeek is actually pretty counter to the narrative of the Chinese government. So when we talked last, Gabriel, we talked about the techno-nationalist rise of China. And a big part of that is China kind of rallying around buzzword technologies and using state guidance funds to really pour money for, again, as we talked about, these hungry entrepreneurs to go chase, right? And so there's this thesis of like naming these technologies that China wants to be superior in, for example, quantum and all these other places. There's a made in China plan, 2025, 2035. And I do think China has had, and I encourage your listeners to like look into this. Like I do think China has had some success with, for example, EVs, where the advantage is that the semiconductors don't have to be that large. I mean, they don't have to be like the size, like the fact that they don't have to be like the latest process. They don't have to be like the 3 nanometer process in order to gain a competitive advantage. And manufacturing big things is basically what China's really good at. Manufacturing complex big things with like a lot of electrical components. That's basically China. China's like the country that's generating the most electricity in the world, is also the one that's generating the most competitive electric vehicles. I believe BYD is actually larger than Tesla. So when you think about what's the world's largest EV company, most people will say Tesla. You can fact check me on this, Gabriel, but I believe it's actually BYD now.
I believe you.
There does seem to be some successes on this front, especially in the places where China is like really strong, which is like just manufacturing, like solar panel manufacturing and like combinatrix. Like what I've observed is that Chinese like high tech manufacturing is pretty advanced in the sense of like at the macro scale. They're pretty good at getting like large components like EVs that already rely on like leveraging existing strength, right? Which is solar panel production, for example. China's scaled out a lot. The AI thing is kind of really interesting because to me, I've done most of my research, including the book, like on just like China chasing after blockchain, which has been like a very mysterious thing to me. Because I tend to think that there is like literally zero usage for any of the use cases that have come out, and it's all vaporware. And despite that, the Chinese government seems insistent that it wants to hire 500,000 people to become blockchain experts. And in my mind, I'm just like, but what does that mean? Like, what are they doing? Like, what is this, right? And there's an incredible amount of patents, and there's these companies. So what it looks like, the average flow of what it looks like is a Chinese bureaucrat will learn from the Chinese plan and they'll say like a technology. They'll be like, we are studying blockchain. We are studying AI. Xi Jinping says something positive about blockchain or AI. And then all these bureaucrats who like manage these state guidance funds and all the banking sector and all this other stuff, they get excited. They're like, oh, this is the new technology. So now anytime an entrepreneur comes, it's like, I'm building something in blockchain. They're like, oh, well, let me know how that goes, right? Like, let me invest right now. They get very excited. This is like approved by Xi Jinping. This is something that's happening in my local district that accords with the national goals. But it's kind of like it's a very disjointed technology development process. And harkening back to that metaphor I had, where it's like, you have the glistening buildings that are being built, but the rivers are trash. Like if you look just a little bit past what the Matrix is trying to show you, you start seeing these big cracks. I think that is what's happening with this kind of like buzzword driven development. And so DeepSeek is actually the complete opposite of how the Chinese government usually tries to propagate this kind of development, how it prides itself on this kind of gold medal disease. China's like, it's so metricized, like money is the religion now, but so are metrics now. So it's like, how much are we going to pay to get a gold medal? How much are we going to pay to have like a Chinese company be the top quantum company, right? That's like kind of how the Chinese state thinks. And actually DeepSeek was completely the opposite. DeepSeek was never had state funding. And DeepSeek was founded by basically like a hedge fund manager who got rich because they were using machine learning to earn money, to do like just hedge fund things. I guess kind of like Renaissance does. And the whole like, using machine learning and finding patterns and, way above my pay grade to like understand how any of that works, but they were able to squeeze out enough advantage to build like a significant fund, and they self-funded DeepSeek. So, it's very interesting that people are now trumpeting it as like China's Sputnik moment, because in actuality, it is something that happened and that China actually had a lot to do with it being held back. So firstly, the people we're talking about are a hated sector, like the financial sector, real estate sector. Every once in a while, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party remembers that it has to pretend to be communist enough and goes and says, this sector is making too much profit. I mean, recently it was more the medical sector. There's corruption, there's this and that. Housing is for living, it's not for speculation, et cetera, et cetera. And then the economy crashes. And then they're like, oh, well, what happened there? It's like, well, the consequences stem from your actions. And this happened almost to DeepSeek, because DeepSeek was made its money in an industry that was like very on the rocks with like the Chinese party state. So, and the other part of that is the Chinese party state. Part of it is, I find it really interesting because it's very similar to Bitmain, which is kind of like the Chinese company that provides most of the Bitcoin mining chips in the world. Like DeepSeek basically went and got a lot of yield because they did not have access to the latest generation chips. And that is because of the US-China kind of like ongoing, the Biden administration put in sanctions. And the idea was to restrict the export of the latest generation, like 3 nanometer, basically processed chips from Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, right? TSMC. I spent a lot of time, so I don't have a lot of direct experience on this, but one of my hobby horses, just by the way, just suggesting this for your readers, is like, I'm on a bunch of these newsletters, like Asianometry, the Semiconductor, I think it's called Semi-Analysis by Dylan Patel, I want to say his name is. And like a bunch of the chip letter, like a bunch of these things that narrowly focus on like explaining like the chip stuff. So, a lot of the stuff passes over my head. I don't know. There's like, this is how to do like a wafer process and this and that. But from what I've gotten from the gist of it is like the export restrictions have not been that effective, but they've been effective enough that Chinese companies are at a competitive disadvantage that they have to solve. But China is also the site of a lot of like manufacturing and hardware kind of innovation, Shenzhen, for example. And so there's a lot of components just similar to how like Bitcoin mining chips emerged from China, just because it's just like a natural function of like, that's where all the economies of scale and collaboration are on that, right? Like if you think about like the innovation economy cluster, right? Like all that, a lot of the component ingredients, like do you need someone to change like this chip? You need an electrical engineer? Like they're all kind of around in China. So, DeepSeek was able to kind of achieve a lot of results. They cribbed code from quite a few people. I haven't gone specifically into the different changes, but they also were able to get more yield by like modifying some of the hardware that they were running on and things like that. And modifying their software to be like the firmware to be like more tailored. These are all Chinese strengths in the sense of like the strengths of entrepreneurs. And this is something that we saw with Bitmain, which was not encouraged by the Chinese state at all and continues to be kind of like a gray zone for the Chinese state. So I actually think of DeepSeek as a little bit like Bitmain, but DeepSeek is now more of a narrative than an actual company and product. And I think when you see that, that's where you see these parts of the story start to get missed. And I think the important point I want to drive home here is that China's kind of model of development was actually counter to how this technology could have developed. Like it created the constraints, and in some ways, constraint is the mother of necessity. So I think the U.S.-China, chip war actually may have helped spur this innovation to a certain degree. Certainly, I think the American companies that are trying to do this by hiring engineers at like 500K a year or $1 million a year and just hiring like 30 or 40 of them, they were going to get their ass kicked in by someone. And, China just makes the most sense. If you read Kai-Fu Lee's book, which by the way, I'm not a big fan of most of his conclusions actually, but, he did hit the nail on the head. Like if you're looking for people who are like hustling and like, nothing is off the table. I can steal code. I can yank code. I can use whatever. Doesn't matter if like Scale AI built this code. It doesn't matter if like OpenAI built this code, right? Like this is something that I can take and just kind of incorporate in, and I'm just going to hustle through it. It was inevitable. I think it was inevitable that someone would eventually kick their ass just because like the locus of the world is trying to raise money for these kind of plays. And you can just do it for much cheaper and much better, which is what China's kind of strong at when it comes to manufacturing this kind of stuff. But I also think that China's state like never really supported it. And so it's kind of like an awkward child. But unlike Bitmain, which built in an industry that the Chinese party state is really against, DeepSeek is more of a favored child. And you're seeing that like, DeepSeek's founder is being invited to like forums with Xi Jinping. You see his hometown kind of celebrating him. And then meanwhile, the founders of Bitmain are kind of split because of the brand word associated. I don't even necessarily know the technology, like that the Chinese state particularly understands the technology, what they're talking about. This is kind of more of an anecdote, but apparently Xi Jinping went to like all the Chinese tech VCs and he was just literally like, why are there not more Chinese unicorns this year? And they were all like, well, should we tell them or not? But like, I mean, he's not thinking in terms of like, that's the other thing. And I might as well take my shot at Xi Jinping now. I know we were talking about this later. I just don't think Xi Jinping's like that smart of a dude. Sorry, like he got into university. This is going to be a little bit of a mini rant, but he got into university because his dad was a senior party official. So he skipped the Gaokao. He skipped the imperial exam that has been China's quote unquote foundation for so long. You earlier we were talking about like China's inability to make like a coherent ideological kind of like indigenous tradition that could be resistant to the Western liberal tradition. And I think that's partially because the leader, Xi Jinping, is like unable to do that in a way that isn't just formulaic. Similarly, I think him and other Chinese party officials, at least from the way I've seen them interact with blockchain, and to a certain extent AI and machine learning, but I'm not as directly like clued into that. I don't directly research that as much, but like I just don't think they understand the technology is as a technology. They understand it more in terms of like, this is a thing we want to be better at. They understand it more in the sense of like an Olympic gold medal. So they're kind of like more like, well, we want this desired output and like, how do we get the money to send it to there? And I think it's instructive to really bring up that DeepSeek succeeded despite them not having the spigot turned on. And I actually think if they get the spigot turned on, you might actually see the opposite result. So they might become more like an OpenAI. But they struggled and hustled a lot because they were not given state largesse. The Chinese state has been trying to create a superior semiconductor manufacturing process for a very, very long time. It has poured billions and billions of dollars into it with very little results. And I think part of it is that the whole thesis that China has for technological development is like entirely wrong. That it's like basically this gold medal chasing. Like, oh, we want to be a better country than the United States at this and that technology. So therefore, tell me how much money it takes and how many companies I need to spawn to make that happen. And like, yeah, you'll brute force, you can kind of get there to a certain degree. Yeah, just ironic to me that the company that seems to embody that the most now, and you see a lot of like Chinese friendly kind of businesses, and it's sparked a little bit of a rally in like the Chinese stock market, really rally around the story of DeepSeek, even though as a symbol, it really isn't like really like the country that really mattered. You know, this is gonna be a really weird example, but I think a DeepSeek also is like Bobby Fischer. Bobby Fischer's this individual level genius that just like was really grokky about chess and was able to beat the USSR's like collected assembly of OpenAI engineers that were world champions of chess just by himself, because he was just had that like he really had a sense for chess, just like DeepSeek CEO. I forget his name, but like DeepSeek CEO does seem to be like a nerd. Does seem to be like actually in the tech, right? Similar to that, I think Bobby was so into the chess and the creativity of chess and things like that. But actually, the country ended up abandoning him. Bobby Fischer also went a little bit nuts towards the end, at least in my opinion. You see something similar with DeepSeek. Like the country wants to carry that as like a banner in a story. You want to believe that Bobby Fischer beat the USSR, and this is a representation of the individualistic American system rising above and beyond. But really, it's a collection of different individuals and companies that had to struggle against the system they were born in.
No, all interesting takes for sure. And I'm happy for you to say what you want on the show. Hold on, let me just cross off that trip to China though, real quick. So get you out of here on two questions here. What are a few books, maybe that we haven't mentioned so far, that people want to start to accumulate some of the knowledge you have on China, or just some of your interests? List off a few books that you'd recommend people read about China.
I think China in 10 Words by Yu Hua is like a pretty good read, and it was actually censored in the mainland. So something that gives, I think, a very balanced and introspective perspective on China and Chinese history. He actually has a firsthand recounting of Tiananmen Square and kind of what happened because he was a student at the time. Very interesting individual. He was a dentist, and then he decided to become an author. And he wrote these books that were kind of like magical realism, kind of like Salman Rushdie. You know, those books got published in mainland China, but they spoke about the same themes. Like he was kind of talking about state repression, but through novels like Brothers, where it was more reflected in like animalistic magical realism, kind of like violence. But as soon as he started writing about it at face value, like actually came out with a book, and China in 10 Words is that book, about what he thought about China, and specifically referred to like Tiananmen Square and like all these incidents. That book was actually banned from the mainland. I always recommend it. Yeah, it depends on how deep your readers want to go. The Age of Ambition, I know, is like a decently good primer. I'm trying to think of like stuff that might be. A lot of the books I might recommend are really, really long.
No, that's fine. What's the one you were currently reading?
Oh, No Hatred. It's either No Enemies, No Hatred, or No Hatred, No Enemies, one or the other.
No enemies, no hatred.
And that's by Liu Xiaobo. So I also recommend that's kind of like an English translation of his collected essays. Yeah, and something about the Cultural Revolution. So I think the most approachable one to me was Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeline Tyne. Madeline is a diaspora writer. She doesn't have any direct experience, but I actually think she's done a lot of her research, and she wrote about it in a very interesting way that I very appreciated. So first, it's a diasporic view, which I always find a little interesting. And then secondly, she actually correlates kind of like what's happened in China to like her deep musical knowledge, very similar to like Thomas Mann and kind of like his novels that he wrote, kind of bringing in a creative element to that. And it's told in a way that's very approachable, novelistic. There are many different novels about that period, but I think that would be the one I would recommend to like kind of sum up what happened. And then there's like the deeper, more policy ones. Yang Ji-san is kind of a historian. The World Turned Upside Down is his recounting of the Cultural Revolution. He also has one on the Great Chinese Famine, which is called Tombstone. Those are really dense books. They're like 800, 700 pages, I think, filled with notes, because he's a real historian. And he's gone into the archives and sourced like very, very detailed and minute stats. I recommend those, but also just like know what you're getting into if you're reading those. And then finally, there's kind of like that overall. Oh well, two books I'll just end off with that are probably a little bit more approachable. One is pretty dense and long. Is I think China a History? I forget the exact name, but there is this book.
China History by John Key.
You're a magical person. But I want to make sure. Is that the one with the blue cover and there's like gold letters on it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, cool. Yeah. So that one is kind of like a good overall view of just like Chinese history. So if you're just interested in like dynastic history, how it all kind of shaped up, that's a good one. And then Jeffrey Wasserstrom, who I mentioned earlier, has like a summary book of China in the 21st century. I believe that's what it's called, like a brief summary of China in the 21st century. And that's like a pretty good guide to like all the recent things. I think we weren't able to cover it, but like China has had multiple periods that are very understudied in the West. That period that we mentioned, the 1980s and 70s, is one of them. Post-Cultural Revolution, but there's also the 1911 Revolution, which I think the May 4th movement, which I think in many ways is actually more interesting than the Communist Revolution, because that's when China shook off the dynastic rule and became a republic of sorts. And then there was a warlord era. So Jeff does have a lot of that. Not just, a lot of histories of China will have just Mao Zedong kind of stop there. Jeff really does cover the gamut of including that like reform and opening up period, as well as the warlord period and the 1911 kind of like Xinhua Revolution, which I think is vastly, vastly understudied. So yeah, those would be my books.
Yeah, certainly your book I'd put on that list as well, as first thing for people to check out. As thanks also for you being on the show. So we'll certainly get you back. I had a lot of good feedback on our first one. People really appreciate what you had to say. So let's end on this one. Then you're writing a new book. What are some of the themes that interest you these days?
Yeah, but the second book I'm writing right now is a little bit more generic. It comes out of this context of studying China and really trying to bring some of the lessons of studying China and, also struggling with privacy preservation in the West, right? And I wanted to write kind of a book that anchored people. And I see you doing a lot of stuff like that, Gabriel, actually, like with Escape to Technocracy and stuff like that. And hopefully we can collaborate actually to some degree on all these fronts. But the general idea was like, how do we get people to more of a rabbit hole? Like they can come out with whatever conclusion they want, but to go a level beyond being a consumer of the internet to at least a more nuanced consumer, if not a producer or maker. I mean, that would be really cool to see. So the subtitle of the book, I titled the book right now, very raw, The Free Future. And the idea is how not to be replaced by AI and to own the future. What I've realized is I think a lot of people around the world are, and it's something I think like I need to like understand a little bit more myself and try to research more. They're very worried about AI for a number of different reasons. They think AI may or may not take over their jobs, take over their lives, become a superior deity. I don't know. So there are a lot of different views that I'm kind of summing up in the book right now in the manuscript. And the idea is to take that view and then say like, okay, well, what are the rabbit holes that you should at least know of, like once you're down this idea? And how can you carve out your own sovereignty and your own space with these changes to come? I've started thinking a lot about liberty at the limits. Like, what is really the limit of liberty these days? This pops up very tangibly for me in terms of like, where should one live to be the most free? So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that really specific question, but also thinking about like all the implications that stem out of that. Like, for example, like basically, I think that a lot of people are really just choosing who they want to surveil them, right? And who their adversary is, or who their maybe not even adversary, but who their kind of like overseer is, right? And I want to get people to just go a level beyond and question: A, should we have those overseers? And B, how can I kind of carve out my own path, get away from borrowing, from the internet? I'm really big on this idea that like most people choose to be tenants of the internet because it's the easy way. Like you choose to create a social media, and I mean we all have social media accounts. It's like not a judgment thing, but we choose to let companies be able to give us the abilities. Like it's just bothersome to put up my own HTTPS, like my own HTML page. So why don't I just use Facebook or whatever? But, I become a product and I become data in their kind of hands. And it's not the kind of thing where it's like, I want to get paid for that. It's more like, how do you get more people to realize the importance of like really owning their digital identity, really owning their digital expression, really owning their privacy, which is, I believe to me, like the ability to choose how they express themselves to the rest of the world, right? And you just simply can't really do that as a tenant of the internet. So I hope that through this hook of like, oh, all these people are thinking about AI and these big tech companies, it's like, well, we need to be thinking about bigger questions like, can states be trusted with these capabilities, right? So hopefully be able to start like people down those rabbit holes. But those are kind of some of the things I'm thinking about. And as I'm kind of going through the manuscript, hopefully have that out by the end of the year or early next year.
Well, you're a good writer. You're a very thoughtful person, so that will be certainly a day one purchase for me. Also have an episode myself, episode 10, Watchman Privacy, called Rental Culture as Slavery, which tells you my thoughts on the matter. So again, thank you, Roger, for joining us on the show. Your book and the various links to things that you have mentioned, we will put in the show notes. Your link to Twitter and Nostr and such. And so, yeah, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gabriel. Enjoyed being on here. Really thoughtful questions. Always down for another round.
Hey, thanks for listening. Look, I could use your help real quick. If you could share this, engage with me in some way, leave a review anywhere. This really helps me to break the technocratic shadow banning that is happening with my brand. And of course, if you really want to escape the technocracy, go to escapethetechnocracy.com. Privacy tutorial series, books, consulting, and of course, you can leave a donation. Thank you very much.